Hello, and welcome to the sixth installation of AWA's Wild Thoughts podcast. My name is Bill Ingersoll, and I am joined today by Kayla White and Mr. Pete Nelson. All of us are longtime members of AWA, and today we're doing something a little different. Instead of discussing an issue or a topic or a special place, we're going to talk about a book. Specifically, we'll be discussing Strange Natures, Conservation in the Era of Synthetic Biology, right there, written by Kent H. Redford and William M. Adams. This book was published in 2021 by Yale University Press. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so I'm gonna kick off the conversation. I'm hoping for a roundtable discussion. I don't have any formal questions written up for anybody, but since I came up with this brainy idea and picked this particular project, I'll go ahead and get things started. So this is by no means a nostalgic look back at conservation of years past by any stretch of the imagination. This is a look forward at what the future might hold. And it's not necessarily something that a lot of people who just like the outdoors and find it calming and refreshing and restorative to the soul would find a lot of comfort in this book. There's a lot of challenging ideas, and I think that's what drew me to the topic. I didn't know much about the authors or the book itself. It was basically a sort of a random reading suggestion that for me earlier this year. I read the book, for just disclosure, I read the book about 6 months ahead of this, discussion. You guys read it more recently, so I'm going by my notes that I wrote down back in May when I read it. So you guys are gonna have a more fresher impression of the book than I do. But Kayla, I know you said you only got through a portion of the book. Was it just because of a time issue? Were you not quite as held by the idea of the book? Was there a particular reason?
Sorry, my dog is barking in the background, of course, but no, I did find it super interesting. I've been bad at like being able to sit down and read lately, I will say. So it was more of that, but when I did read it, I did find it really interesting. And yeah, it's something that like I don't know how to feel about. It's something where it's like, it seems almost too good to be true in some ways. And I also like my gut feeling is like we shouldn't be doing these sorts of things. I don't know how everyone else felt about the book, but I think it's really interesting. It brings some like really ethical like dilemmas and yeah. So I don't know. What were your both of your gut feelings to the book? What did you think?
Well, since Bill started talking first, I'll just jump in and answer your question. It'd be useful maybe to say what it's about, since people don't necessarily know. It is a look at the future, but it's specifically about the fact that the modern age of genetic manipulation, which indeed happens at the level of the genome and at the level of DNA, has blurred the line between natural and artificial. So that if we think about trying to save a species or stop an invasive species, or maybe bring back a species that's near extinction or even entirely extinct, we have the genetic capacity to play God like we never have before at a very accelerating pace. So what's natural anymore? That's really what it's about. I thought the book was good, informative. I think, and this isn't really a dig at you, Kayla, but the most important chapter is the last one. I think that the authors talk about a way that we can be hopeful about the work that we do as conservators of nature, even if we grant, and I think we must, my own opinion is we must, that the line between natural and artificial is long gone. So it becomes then a matter of what's wise and what's judicious. And I'm sure I'll get a chance to say this later, but I thought there were two things about this that are very relevant to what AWA does. So I'm even more excited to do what AWA does, because I think that two things in particular that we're particularly interested in speak to wise consideration of this kind of stuff rather than just, looking the other way or pretending it doesn't exist. So that question of what's natural or not is at the heart of the whole thing. And it's a challenge to all of us.
Right. Yeah. The gist of this book is right there in the subtitle, Synthetic Biology, which the authors described as bringing modern engineering principles to the design and construction of living systems, calling biology the oldest technology. So when we think of conservation, traditionally we think of land acquisition and reforestation. But they're not thinking of anything like that. And in fact, I sort of, as I was reading through that, they sort of had sort of a condescending look at that sort of old-fashioned conservation. So a lot of what they're talking about is genetic information, using genetics to save threatened species, to not just save populations, but to restore genetic diversity in those populations. For instance, there was a discussion about the genetic bottleneck for California condors, that suffered a population crash, where their numbers are so low that yes, members of that species still exist and are being actively preserved by conservationists out west. However, what future does the condor has if there, if there are so few individuals left that basically any future population is going to be inbred. And so where this book tries to lead us into different ways of thinking is saying, well, okay, well, maybe genetics can be used to not only save the California condor, but to reintroduce genetic variety so that any future population might be more robust. Were there any other ideas in the book that captured your attention, that you thought would be, hey, I never thought of that, this would be interesting. Pete, did you have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, one thing in particular out of the two that I think are important for our work in AWA was a discussion of ecological integrity. So we're all for that. We want intact ecosystems. We want biodiversity. We want the ecosystem to be as natural as they can be and complete as they can be. So the book makes a pretty good argument that whether it's our own manipulation, which human beings have been doing for millennia, of course, we're just doing it faster now, and we're doing it at a genetic level. Whether it's that or it's directly or it's indirect effects of all of the other things that we're doing on the planet. And goodness knows, even genetic manipulation, which is going to be hard to keep in the lab. So it could have a dramatic unintended consequence. They talk a lot about that in the book too. They have an idea whether all those things are impacting a particular ecosystem or not. They have an idea that what's less important is to think statically of what that ecosystem was, and more important to think about how complete it is as a functioning system, where, as they put it in the book, all the cogs and wheels are in place. So it may not be the same genetic makeup that it was a century ago, but it's a rich enough and diverse enough genetic makeup that we have an intact system that functions in and of itself, maintains its own diversity. And that's kind of promising, because then if there is something that we want to do to preserve a species, protect a species, or reintroduce a species in ways that are fundamentally unnatural, we're still contributing to the richness of an ecosystem that has its own ongoing life. They had a quote from a writer named Mary Douglas that this is an aesthetic question, which is another really important part we can talk about later, that she says dirt is soil that's out of place, right? So the question of what a kind of ecosystem is impeding important is partly an aesthetic one. Their argument is that even with artificial means, you can have an ecosystem that has all the cogs and wheels moving. It is sustaining its own diversity, So then the aesthetic questions are more important than just the question of whether the biology works. Let's have the biology work, natural or artificial, and then we can think about what we want out of this ecosystem.
Yeah, Kayla, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because I as I was reading it and kind of, thinking about it, I keep coming back to like, well, will we learn our lesson though? Like, if we can just manipulate everything, and like, would that mean that, like, thinking about climate change, does that then mean that like corporations feel like they don't have to try as hard to cut back emissions because we can just bioengineer the creatures and ecosystems to be more resilient to climate change? I just think of like, maybe we the an animal, bottlenecks and then therefore is dead. Like, do we deserve to then have that animal? Obviously the animal deserves to live for sure, but it's almost like, are we going to like understand our consequences on the ecosystem, or does that kind of take away the thought of us having those consequences? You know what I mean? Like, being responsible, because we are responsible for climate change. We're responsible for what we've done to this earth. And I guess it just makes me a little worried that like we're like, oh well, we can just fix it, it's fine. And not that that's the tone of the book. I definitely don't think that it is, but it makes me a little bit worried when we talk about maybe this topic a little bit. I don't know what your guys' thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because that was a big part of my notes when I read this back in the spring, was that I did notice, that throughout the book, the authors sort of had a condescending attitude towards traditional conservation. They mentioned, a lot of inconsistencies with what conservation says it is and what it does. And I don't know, I can't necessarily verify their numbers, but I know they early in the book, they quoted how 37% of the federally designated wilderness areas throughout the U.S., have some sort of management interventions. Instead of just leaving it be as we traditionally think of wilderness, there actually is people going in to manage wildlife and invasive species and so forth. And I know it happens. I just can't verify the 37% of figure that they quote. There's a lot of talk about how in England where instead of having wilderness preservation, they have something called rewilding. Way back when marshes were thought to be malarial and full of diseases, it was a popular thing in England to drain the marshes and turn them into fields and cropland and whatnot. But now modern English people are realizing that, hey, we used to have a lot of wildlife here that no one has seen since 1400. So they're going in with bulldozers and recreating some of these marshes and stuff. And the authors say, aha, you're using technology to enhance wildlife. Therefore, if you have some amphibian who's suffering, the population is suffering from a disease that was caused by human actions, not that we gave the disease directly to the amphibian, but some human activity transported the disease, and now that's this disease that was endemic to Asia is now impacting populations of amphibians, throughout Europe or what have you. Well, here we are with this tool that we can use to make the threatened amphibian more disease resistant and therefore save them that way. And so, getting to what you were saying, although this isn't necessarily spelled out in the book, but what I got from my takeaway is that the authors have sort of like this idea that conservation is sort of backwards, and genetic modification is the way of the future. But I was thinking that, well, really conservation as we espouse it we're talking about adapting human behavior to accommodate nature. So if we figured out that something that we're doing is threatening some endangered amphibious population, well, what can we do to stop that from happening, to let the amphibian recover on its own in its own natural habitat, and we can do something that's not too painful, and everybody is happy. Whereas with the synthetic biology and genetic modification, it's a tool that we're going to forcibly adapt nature to accommodate mankind. It's not spelled out in so many words in the book, but that was one of the themes that I picked up on by the time I got to the closing chapters. I don't know what you guys were thinking.
Well, I to go back to what Kayla said, for me, I guess all my life I've connected the aesthetic with what's ethical. I think they're deeply connected, which is why our work, AWA's work, which involves a lot of aesthetics, what we think we mean by wilderness, and what we seek in remoteness and solitude, and how we consider those rare. And what all of us, I mean, the one thing I love about AWA is we all spend a whole lot of time back there. And we know the Adirondacks, we know these forests, and we know what we find beautiful. I think the decisions about what we should or shouldn't do with synthetic biology have at root those really, really important aesthetic and ethical questions. And I think we need to tread lightly in the Adirondacks, because it contains fairly intact ecosystems. It's had been well protected and well recovered. So I think there's a measure of care that we need. But let's challenge this a little, and let me offer a specific example, because there is a place for this, at least to consider it. We all know the threat of the hemlock woolly adelgid, right? That can, if it were unchecked, would eventually get in the park, and the mortality rate for hemlocks is somewhere north of 85 or 90%. It would devastate hemlocks in the forest preserve, the Adirondack Forest Preserve. I just came out of the land that my wife and I have. On the way out of that beautiful weekend up in the forest, we come to the end of an esker. Like many eskers, it's populated with hemlocks that love that soil. A whole forest is different. I can't even think of those hemlocks not being there. So one of the treatments that's being tried in the park, I'm sure you both know, is a silverfly from the West Coast that seems to be very effective in attacking the larva of the adelgid and can arrest an infestation. So what if there's a way to make the silverfly, using genetic manipulation, more resistant to the colder weather that's found in the Adirondacks? And by the way, I looked up some white papers. People are looking at that. What if there was a way to improve its breeding rate using genetic manipulation, where there was, it's contained within that species, so there's not going to be a leak outside the species? That's one of the things that they talk about in the books. There's some changes that are between species, that's more dangerous in what they describe than things that are cisgenetic, which are within a species, which could theoretically happen naturally. But if we can speed that up, if we can make a better silverfly, and we can stop the threat of the woolly adelgid from devastating hemlocks, why shouldn't we do that?
But then, and I don't know with the white fly, like, what are the consequences of having the white fly then be part of the ecosystem? Like, I do really hate when it's like, oh, there's an invasive species, let's introduce this other thing that's not here and try and fix it, because like that's happened in lots of other places too. Not great. It's like we don't always think of the full consequences or understand the full consequences until they happen. And so, I don't know. I don't think the answer is to do nothing, but I get a little wary that we're just gonna keep screwing things up. Like, yeah, that's a little bit how I feel about it. What do you think, Bill?
Just briefly, for people who are curious, Cornell University has something called the New York State Hemlock Initiative. You can read all about all of this stuff that they're working on researching, and they're asking that question, of course. You know, so far it appears that the introduction of the silverfly is benign, but we all know it's more complicated than that, which is why Kayla's going like this. So, I mean, these are hard questions. And I think that the aesthetic piece of it, which is the heart of things that we do, is a really important part of how we make decisions.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one thing to fight invasive species with invasive species, by, so if you have one pest, whether it be a plant or an insect or what have you, that's out of its native habitat, in some place new, where it's basically an unchecked, it's basically experiencing unchecked growth because there are no natural predators for it. So you introduce something that is a predator to specifically to try and keep that pest in check. That's one thing. But a lot of the things, that's in this book, we're talking about, using genetic engineering to modify pests or their controls, to make them either make the pest less pestersome, or the check more, give it more powers of control, by tweaking some little trait or what have you. For instance, like mosquitoes, in a lot of parts of the world, mosquitoes are vectors for disease. Thankfully, not around here. But you can imagine that, in parts of the tropics, it's highly desirable to do a gene drive to if not wipe out mosquitoes, to make them less likely to communicate diseases to humans. Well, if they can do that, for for a major human health cause, then it's not a major step for somebody around here to decide, well, we have mosquitoes too. They may not give me malaria, but they're a big pain in the butt every June and July. So why can't we do a gene drive here to make mosquitoes go away for the Adirondacks and increase tourism? Or say you're doing something that that's more trying to be more benign by trying to save a species or get rid of a particular pest, and you introduce some genetic modification that you're intended to be targeted to this population that's not where it's supposed to be, that's threatening hemlock trees in the Adirondacks or what have you. And you're thinking, okay, well, this hemlock woolly adelgid in the Adirondacks is not where it's supposed to be. We're going to go into the Adirondacks and introduce these genetically modified adelgids that'll go through the population and accomplish good things. But what if those modified genes, and these are threats that are addressed in the book too. What if they spread into nature in ways that you didn't anticipate? So through horizontal gene transfers or trophic cascades, or if the genetic modification goes back to the original host population, wherever the hemlock woolly adelgid originally came from, and is not perceived as a problem, you may wipe out the entire species when all you wanted to do was just put one specific population that's a pest in this one place and under control. There are unforeseen consequences that people are talking about. But because this is also new, no one can really say how, if we do this, that will be the result. So that was some things that I picked up on. And certainly, there are, some potential useful applications. I made some notes about, some of these synthetic biology techniques could be used for restoring chestnut trees. For making bats more resistant to white nose syndrome. And another tree pest, longhorn beetles. There are a lot of opportunities to use synthetic biology here in New York State. But yeah, there are risks. And we can sort of postulate what they might be, but this is also new. No one can really say how it'll all turn out.
Sure. And one of the things they say at the end of the book, near the end of the book, is that the genomes of various species that are well understood are proving to be fertile areas for research, but those aren't wild species. If the genomes of wild species and basically the genetic behavior of wild species are not well known, which is all the more reason to tread lightly, since that's what we're interested here. I certainly think that tread lightly is some important phraseology, particularly in the Adirondacks, since that's what we care about, and since it is already a complete and diverse set of ecosystems. So, there's no stopping it. I think we have to acknowledge that. There's no stopping it, and there's no knowing for sure where it's going to go. So I think it's something, I'm glad you brought this book up, Bill, because I think it is something for all of us to pay attention to. And it's important for us to admit when something we want to do in conservation has an artificial aspect to it, has some sort of artifice, and we have to then consider it from other perspectives than just the gain that we're going to see. I think there'll be more and more cases, and it's not just, gene driving and using CRISPR either. We had this very thing when we were fighting to have Gulfbrook Road closed and have the Boreas Tract be classified as wilderness and maintained that way. There was debate over whether dams should be removed. And I'm sure you'll all remember, and one of the problems with removing the dams is that the depth of the water would decrease, and there are some strains of brook trout that are doing very well in Boreas, and it's the kind of brook trout that we want to maintain. They would lose habitat. So, that those kinds of debates at whatever level, I think are going to get more intense. This was a good book to remind us that treading lightly is, I think, an imperative for us.
Now there's
Right.
one, there is one, we only have a few minutes left, I think, there is one big topic in the book that we haven't mentioned yet, and I'm not sure we'll go into too much detail into it, but de-extinction. Does the world need woolly mammoths again?
Oh boy. Taylor, why don't you take that one?
I think we should leave things that are extinct and just focus on what we have. I think one thing that I find interesting, I was thinking about it as listening to you two talk, is and something that we all think about a lot, and is about how we are a part of nature. Like, no matter what we do has consequences to nature. And I was thinking of, like, black fly season, and how we go out, like how the towns have people go out and spray to like limit the number of black flies, and kind of kill more of them and different things like that. Like, we already alter nature so much, and I feel like that's like really at the heart of the book. And I think it's maybe the greatest thing that we can kind of really remember is that we are part of nature. Everything we do has different consequences, some good, some bad. But yeah, I think that is something that we should always carry with us when we're trying to, advocate, when we're trying to live in the world, make better choices, when we go out and recreate, but really we're a part of it, right? It's not just going out into it, we are in it, even in these artificial houses, right? It's all nature.
Yeah, I did get the sense that the authors, they wrote how they were trying to be neutral and not necessarily take a stance, but and they wrote about some of their issues in the past, talking about these topics, how one side or the other is accusing them of being biased, either against traditional conservation or against genetics or whatnot. And I will say that as I'm reading this, someone who's probably well on the side of traditional conservation, being a wilderness advocate, in the business of working to preserve land in the wilderness that we have, I sort of perceived that these authors had sort of that they were trying to sell me on ideas that I might otherwise be reluctant to buy. A part, a large part of the crux of their argument is that yes, because there really is no truly wild place on Earth. Even our remotest wilderness areas are impacted by climate change and acid rain and so on and so forth. But they then make the leap and say, okay, well, since nature really doesn't exist as we want to believe it does, then why are we hesitating to do all these man-made things that can make we can engineer a better wilderness if we want to. And I'm imagining people out there engineering deer that are fatter and slower and easier for people to hunt and fish that are easier to catch and engineering these species and releasing them to the wild. So forget about releasing bass into protected trout waters. We may be seeing a decade later in the century where we're dealing with genetically engineered organisms. I'm not even talking about GMOs, but actually wild creatures that were genetically engineered to be more pleasing and tasty to people running through our woods. That's where my paranoid brain was starting to go by the time I got to the last page. So Pete, what were your last thoughts? We only have a few more minutes.
My last thoughts are pretty close to yours. I think here's a sideline here. I'm reminded of the famous quote from Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart about pornography when the Supreme Court was taking a case of pornography, and he said, "I know it when I see it." And there's a wonderful, blunt, common sense piece to that. The idea of untrammeled, the idea that we have land that we're protecting, as you said, Bill, that we want to leave in as much of a natural state as possible. We want to protect it. We want it free of the imprint of humankind as much as possible, as reflected in the Wilderness Act and as reflected in the guiding documents for the Adirondack Park. There may be complexities, and it may be, as you said, really possible to say that there's nothing that's not impacted by human beings, and the line between natural and artificial is so blurred that we can't ever go back. That may all be true, but I know untrammeled when I've seen it. We all experienced that in the Adirondack backcountry, which is why the tread lightly piece is so terribly important. I just think this book, as I already said, calls us to be a little bit more vigilant about the impact of this kind of genetic behavior. It doesn't mean that it isn't always, that it's always the wrong thing to do, but it means that it's always requiring an elevated sense of what aesthetically is important, what ethically is important. And then one last tiny little thing, just has nothing to do with the subject of the book, but it's just too fun when you read things and you find weird connections. At the very beginning of the book, the authors talk about Hayley Woods in England, which maintains old forest, of which there's very little in England. It was held in that state for centuries because it was landed gentry, in this case religious, who protected it. In this case, the Bishop of Ely. And the Bishop of Ely is indeed a direct descendant, or direct ancestor, I should say, of William Watson Ely, who did this incredible map in the Adirondacks. So worldwide, that's the kind of thing I like. Worldwide, we have all these beautiful connections. Book was useful to read.
Kayla, just a couple of minutes left. Any final thoughts?
No, I think we covered it. Thank you all for having such a great discussion. I love thinking about these things, and I think that's why I really enjoy my time on the board with you all, is that we don't take these things lightly. We have deep philosophical discussions, and we really try and think critically about these issues and these topics. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I nominate you for the next book selection, whenever that may be. We want to do a Tyra Olsted's book. So I got my copy, so just name the date and And I'll be
Sounds
there in
great.
2024 for the next discussion. But yeah, we're running out of time here, so let's wrap this up. Thank you for joining us, folks. As we draw towards the end of 2023, we are wrapping up our first year as podcasters. Yay! The Wild Thought series is a new undertaking for us, and with your support, we hope to grow it into an entertaining and informative resource for all things Adirondack Wilderness. Please share your thoughts and feedback, and remember that we are a small grassroots organization with a small budget and big ambitions. If you liked what you've seen, please visit us at AdirondackWilderness.org and click that donate button. That's all for tonight. So on behalf of all of us at AWA, goodbye for now, and we'll see you on the trail.
Bye.
Bye-bye.